Okay, everybody, I'm going to make sure you can see my screen. Yes. All right. Um, I also want to get the chat up so that you can introduce yourselves. Ah, I am having, all right. I'm going to start over here. Put this up here. I am, give me a second here, everybody. I'm trying to get the chat up. There we go. All right. Feel free to say hello. I am now going to get started, promise. All right, I'm hoping that if you can't see, just open the mic and let me know, okay? So I am Linda Dornbos. Thank you. I am at Oakland University. I am a social studies elementary teacher educator, and it's exciting to be hanging out with some social studies people that, have put in a long day but still are here. And we're just here to talk about these counter narratives so that we go beyond the danger of a single story. I do want you to know that I will be sharing these slides, and I also have a Google folder that I'm going to share with you in a few minutes so you'll have access. Know also that if something's in blue and underlined, it's in the Google Slides that you can go to on your own, but it's also probably going to be in the Google folder. And this is a wonderful TED Talk. It's a few years old about the danger of a single story, but it's a go-to and it's a wonderful TED Talk. Today, I just want to, tonight, just talk about my experiences, my story, explain what I mean by counter narratives and looking at those through a critical literacy lens, but then also exploring how do we enter the standards and what are some examples that I've done and that with critical inquiry, and then talk a little bit about the possibilities and the problems that we face. Just a little bit about me and my story. I grew up on the other side of the state in Grand Rapids. My early years of teaching, 4 years, were actually at the school that I went to, K through 9, that I coached at while I was in college. And so I never left the place. And talk about a single story, very white space, very dominant narrative. My world was revolutionized when my husband and my young daughter at the time, we decided to do something quite radical and we moved to Gallup, New Mexico. And I had the wonderful privilege of teaching at a former boarding school near the Navajo reservation. And I think there's people waiting to get in. I can't get to that screen. And that just revolutionized who I was. It's interesting because does anybody know how to get the bar is going across the people that I'm trying to admit into it to the room, and I can't I can't get rid of the control panel at the top. Anybody have any ideas how you do that? It's in the way of me letting people in. Oh, there we go. Okay, so moving to New Mexico, teaching at a former boarding school. In my 7th grade class, I wound up with Navajo, Zuni, Hispanic, Hopi, Asian, Black, Anglo, all in one room. And it made me see the world differently. It made me see teaching differently. It made me see what we do about connecting lessons and curriculum to real life. And so I had a wonderful experience there, changed who I was, how I saw the world. Also, while we were there, we had another child born with multiple physical and cognitive issues. So that expanded my world even more. But at the age of 5, when we could no longer get the services that we needed for him, we moved back to Michigan in search of good healthcare and actually good special education. So I taught for a couple years in an urban setting in Grand Rapids, but then wound up finding myself back in very white suburbia in Zeeland, Michigan, where I taught for 18 years. And I was actually at the school that my son was in inclusive special ed there. And it just gave me this huge passion for, okay, this is the story in this white space, and how do we bring the world into the classroom? Because we can't go explore the world like I would want to, but how do we bring those stories in? After 28 years of being a classroom teacher, I stepped out, went to MSU, graduated with my PhD in 2018, and this is now my third year at OU, where I share my passion for bringing stories into the classroom and expanding our world to better understand it, to pre-service teachers and also to teachers in the area. And so my purpose then is to always be thinking and getting kids to think about this too. So what is my story? And how have I learned to see and experience the world? But then how do I disrupt that so I can see that I'm part of a larger story out there? And how do others in the world perceive and have experienced the world? And then develop alongside other people. What is our role in that larger society? Because that's our goal, right? And then how do I work with others to create a more just society, not just for me and mine, but for everybody? And we can do that through powerful social studies by making meaningful lessons that connect to the real world, that integrate that disciplinary knowledge, that we help students to see the lens that they're looking through, and that we challenge them beyond just sitting and getting, so that they're actively involved in the learning process and transforming the world. And as this is probably quoted more than any other poem right now, but I just love the end of the poem that Amanda Gorman did at the inauguration, because I do believe that there's light if we're only brave enough to see it, and that we're only brave enough to be it. So how do we step into the lives of students and help them to see and understand and act? And I think the keynote speakers this week have just been powerful in sharing their stories of how we can do that. And just listening to Owen tonight was just a powerful reminder of that. And so I do want to just start with what do I mean by counter narratives and critical literacy? And so by counter narratives, I'm defining that as anything that's written or visual or oral that just goes beyond that traditional normative white story that is often told, to bringing in stories of those who have been underrepresented or maybe misrepresented, or actually that their stories are missing. And we do that so we can of course celebrate diversity, because there's beauty in that, and we can illustrate it. But we also know that that diversity just is messy and it's complex. And how do we enter into that and do the messy learning of entering those stories? And then challenge assumptions and definitely disrupt when there's harm being done. And so we do that through critical literacy, asking those questions so that we disrupt, we question, and we interrogate those choices that privilege a way of thinking. And we have to teach children how to do that, to read the word, but also read the world, so that we're taking action, that we're helping kids become problem solvers in the classroom, in the communities, in the larger world. And that every decision they make, they have to realize that decisions affect other people. And that decisions, are we making them, well, once again, just for me and mine, or are we thinking of other people as we do that? So let's just explore a little bit. How do we do that when we have these expectations, these standards, these stories that we need to tell? And so we're looking at that. We also interrogate those stories. We're constantly looking at the standards, asking questions. Well, what story is being told through these events, through these content standards that we're told that we need to teach through a disciplinary lens? How do we see who's telling that story? And how do we bring in other voices to those stories? Whose voice might be missing from the story? How does that story help us understand and see our stories better? But then how does it help us act in the world so that we're working for the common good? Because we want to make sure that people thrive and flourish and not just barely survive. And we do that through, of course, the inquiry arc. That's now the procedures that we use to enter that. So as we're developing those compelling questions and getting kids involved in the messy work of inquiry and using those different disciplinary lens to look at stories, we want to ask those same questions, because that's what we want to do through inquiry, is that help kids explore, help them evaluate sources, help them see what kind of sources are valid, and how do we look at those? What tasks do we enter them in? so that they can become informed and that they can talk about what they're seeing, that their thinking can change over time, and that they can see that they're becoming people who want to live and act in the world in different ways. So how do we do this? So we talked about the what and and the why, but how do we avoid the single story? How do we critically engage into that broader narrative? And what I really believe that we have to do is start with those learning communities. We have to build these inquiry-based learning so that together we decide that we're seeing differently so that we can do differently. So then what I'm going to do is just share 3 ideas that I have done in the last few years to build the learning community. One of them I adopted from something that saw at the MCSS convention 3 years ago by Linda Monk. Brought us this wonderful image of these license plates to depict the preamble of the United States. And the kids love this, they eat this up, they try to figure it out. But I think in the room, where can we have a visual where the kids see constantly this reminder of we the people of the United States trying to establish a more perfect union? Because as we enter these stories, I think we constantly have to say, well, who's we the people? How's it being defined in this story? How are they defining what a perfect union actually looks like? So as we're entering current events, the storming of the Capitol, what did the people who were storming the Capitol, who did they believe we the people is? How are they defining a more perfect union, and how are they acting on that in harmful ways? If we're talking about indigenous people, how were they being defined? They were being defined as savages, and they weren't involved in we the people. How are those great stories of resistance where they are claiming to be a people that are trying to establish a more perfect union with others? So I think there's just a wonderful way to constantly be bringing in these questions, have these questions up by it. What's the story that being told as we do this unit? Who's telling it? How we define it determine who's left out or misrepresented? And I think it's always this issue of power, of being used for the common good or for the good of a few, or or is it being abused? And so we bring in those written texts, we bring in maps, we bring in charts, we bring in oral stories, we bring in all kinds of stories that we ask these questions of. Another way that I've done this is you go to Walmart and you buy one of these 3-foot by 18-inch mirrors that cost about $4. And you tell the kids that you're going to walk around with a mirror. And this is the generation that has done selfies, so they love it actually. And you see them sitting up in their chair and they're starting to fix their hair. And as you walk around, they're making, the proper selfie pose. And you do that very slowly, and you let each one of them look at themselves in the mirror. And then you split them up into groups, and you can do this in different ways across different grade levels, but you can cut out these little pieces of mirror and then give each group a different experience of a different group of people. So what I did, I was inspired by the book Takaki, which is a different mirror for young people, written at about 5th or 6th grade level, about 9 different groups' experiences in the United States: Jewish, Irish, Japanese, Chinese as they came to America, Mexicans as they found themselves part of America. And I chunked the information that I found in the introduction. So it's just a short amount of material, and they each had 2 mirrors for their group, and then one mirror they just had to write a fact about the people. So for example, the Irish came here after the potato famine in their own country, and when they came here, they took jobs helping with the roads, the railroads. And on the other one, they had to put the experience, how others were treating them. So maybe on the Irish one, they wrote that they were hated because they were Catholics. And so the Protestants just thought they were evil and that they were savages, just like the indigenous people. Then we took them and poster puttied them to the same mirror. And then I walk around the room, and every time I have done this, it is just intriguing what happens. It becomes just dead silent. Students lean ahead as they're looking, and they don't want me to move on because they're reading the stories of these other people, and they're no longer focused on themselves. And when we're done with that whole activity, we sit in a circle and we just talk about what happened, and we talk about the way that we can bring in other people's stories and where that places us, and how we can focus on other people and their stories and their experiences. Then a third one, this is one of my favorites, and I took this from Jay Bickford, and the PDF is in the file that I will share with you. But this you could do across ages, because I've done this with middle schoolers. I've even done it with high schoolers and pre-service teachers. And these use two different books. And these books really help us start to think about in our communities about how history is told, because we can address issues of evidence and source and bias and perspectives through the reading of these two books. So how do you do it? I Am the Dog, I Am the Cat book is a marvelous picture book because it has pictures on one side and very simple text on the other about a dog and a cat. And you could take it, depending on what grade level you want to do this with, you could take as few as a few pictures, or you could copy black and white up to 13 pictures. And what you do is you split the kids up into groups and you give them each the same set of pictures, and you tell them to, with their group, lay out the pictures and create a story. After everybody's created their story, we walk around and do like a gallery walk, and everybody shares the story, the narrative that they have come up with. And it's just really interesting to see that everybody creates a different story, even though they've all been given the same pictures. And so then we talk about this, like, how is history told? How is it recorded? How do historians shape their stories with evidence? And how does it depend on who's telling the story, what story, and why it matters? And who's privileged in the story? And what were the biases that went into the way that we decided that the dog and the cat were interacting? And then in another day or the same lesson, what you could do with the next book, this is just a wonderful book to read out loud. It's called Hey Little Ant. And it shows the powerful story of what it means to have perspective and interpretations and bias, because the kid wants to, it's done in a very sing-songy, rhymey story, but that's fun to read. But the kid wants to squish the ant because he's worthless and he doesn't do any good in the world. And the ant speaks up and says, hey, wait a minute, I do good in the world. And they start to go through this whole story. Wherever the boy says, well, I do this, the ant also explains how they do that in their community. And then they're having a picnic, and the pictures of the ant stealing just a tiny little crumb that had fallen to the wayside, with the bandit eyes and the great big sack. And then him speaking up at the end, where he becomes big and the powerful, talking about how he is important and he's feeding his family. And so it's just a great way, after you've talked about history as told, to start talking about perspectives and interpretations that can be harmful, the way that we see the world or that we interpret other people. And these two books just are a great way to enter the conversation, build that community so that you can do the hard work of bringing in critical literacy lessons. So I just want to share with you a few examples. I hope that they spark your curiosities and initiate some ideas of your own. For those in kindergarten and first grade, we choose the things in the standards that we know that we do, and we try to expand to make the story broader. And so maybe when we go to the library, we sit down and we read My Librarian is a Camel, and that goes through many different countries about how kids actually get their books, so that we can bring the world into the classroom, even at a kindergarten level, to show that people live differently, and that differently is okay, and different is good. And how do we see that? I was at a school up north where they, for school life, the school brought in a guest speaker, the first graders did, and they interviewed her. She was 93 years old, and she had taught in that very room of that school. And she helped them think historically about same and different. What's the same about school when she taught many, many, many years ago, and what is different? And she told them stories of when kids would get spanked, and they just were so intrigued by that. So how do you bring in these different stories of the past? These, what makes holidays special or why do I have to be responsible? Those are written by the C3 in the C3 framework. If you click on those, it brings you to the C3 teachers that are just a marvelous place to go look for compelling questions, supporting questions. Even if you can't do the whole unit, they have wonderful resources to use. Bring in stories of other religions and other ways that people live. This was one that was just shared with us the other night by the keynote speaker. And they have a whole site so that we can better understand the Sikh religion and discussion guides with these. And this is about a little boy who loves to wear different colored turbans to fit his mood. Or about families, showing how families are different. How about instead of doing just tracing a family tree that might cause traumatic experience for some students, that we talk about how our families are the same or different. And building that broader narrative, we have to look at our books. This is one that's used a lot in the classroom. It's just written from a very North American perspective. Just the fact that she's this great big stance of me, here I am on the map. The whole book is basically about her world. It does a good job of showing the expanding and coming back, but there's no other people in this book. And so how about if alongside of that book, if we're going to use it, we also bring in books about how other people live in the world. And that instead of, standing with this stance of, hey, we take me on the map and turn it into how are we on the map together. In 2019, I had a student just do a marvelous lesson for second grade in Pontiac. She was just really wanted to bring in local history, critical history. She created 4 journey boxes that just had several artifacts in it of maps and postcards and pictures and short little stories, because the second graders all of them weren't able to read a lot of heavy text. So she had a lot of hands-on things, put them in groups. The journey boxes were by decades, and she wanted the kids to know the story of their city. And so each of them took a decade, and they had to investigate these sources and then try to tell the story in any way that they could. So they started drawing and putting words if they could. And then they did a gallery walk where they shared the decade with each other. So we saw the history of Pontiac, and they tried to explain to each other what had happened in their city. And then the wonderful question, Pontiac, what's next? The last action question in her was, what's the future and what is your role in it? And these second graders did amazing things as they drew pictures of what they wanted their city to look like and how they were going to be a part of that. One girl drew she was drawing food, and I sat down next to her and I said, well, what are you drawing? And she said, food. And I said, well, why are you drawing food? She says, well, we don't have access to good food. I buy food at the gas station all the time, and my mom says it's really expensive. So here she was taking on, the food deserts. And another little boy was actually drawing a gun. So instead of being super alarmed, I just sat down to him and I said, well, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm drawing a gun. I said, well, what is that? Why are you drawing a gun? And he said, because in my city, we need to get rid of the homeless shelters, or if we have homeless shelters, they have to be better guarded because I don't feel safe at night at mine. So here he was bringing these second graders. Sometimes we don't give them enough credit for what they can talk about and what they want to talk about and how they can dream about how they want a better future. So how can we get them to better understand the past so that they can better live in the present and better envision a better future? And so that was a powerful, and we're in the process of taking that and now writing in using a C3 framework, because we realized that this is not something that we can replicate in other classrooms, because it just took her a long time and to order postcards and to get maps, that's not doable. So this summer, we're going to sit down and actually write this so we can share it with teachers in Michigan, especially teachers in the Pontiac area, because it was just a wonderful lesson with great inquiry questions, but not accessible if you don't have those supplies. So we're going to try to put that into the C3 framework and other resources. Right now, I have a student who I was hoping that this lesson was going to be done, but COVID has slowed us all down a little bit. And she was inspired by the book club that we're doing in one of my classes on the Indigenous peoples' history of the United States. Just an amazing book that shows us history through the eyes of Indigenous peoples and their resistance to the taking of their land. And she knows that third graders do study Indigenous people in Michigan, but she wanted to come at it from she said they need a broader lens. They need to talk about the land, because everything's about the land. And they need to see what happens when people who think the land is sacred and have this deep relationship with the land, and when there's another group of people that come in where the land is more a commodity and that it's private property, what happens when those worlds collide? So she wanted third graders to, it's almost could be a fifth grade lesson too, because you do this in fifth grade, but she wants to even bring in the idea of manifest destiny and have kids in third grade level interrogate that. So she's in the middle of creating, this is what she started, and she's talking about how do we get this whole idea of the land that is often so foreign to us to set that kids can understand it through books and maps and things that are offered in this book for teachers. Actually, how did European settlers view the land, and then how did that impact the relationship? But then how does that matter for what we're doing today, and connecting with tribal people here in Michigan and bringing in some guest visitors. So stay tuned for that. That's a work in progress, but she's having a good time trying that. She's a pre-service teacher. Then for fourth grade, I'm working with another student doing an independent study who is just doing a marvelous job of creating a lesson or a unit around January Sparrow, which is a story that takes place here in Michigan of the Crosswhite family that in the 1840s was escaping slavery, going through the Underground Railroad, and ended from Kentucky to Marshall, Michigan. And what happens is that because of the Fugitive Slave Act, their slave owner actually found out where they came and was going to bring them back, and they were fearing for their life. They were fearing they were going to be separated. And it's just this marvelous story of the people in the community in Marshall, Michigan, that came together, white and Black people, to save this family and allow them to escape to Canada. And then this family actually comes back to Marshall after the Civil War. And there's, she wanted to teach this as creating it. She wanted to teach it in a classroom, but COVID kept her from that. So she taught it to her two young boys. And they actually drove to Marshall, Michigan, and there's a big historical marker there. But she's also in the middle of writing this. We're going to get it done soon. But she has this intriguing, compelling question of lawmakers or lawbreakers, the Crosswhites in the community of Marshall, Michigan. So she wants to do some geography work of what's the path that they maybe took and how do we know? What is the Underground Railroad? What was that community like? Because it was a community in Marshall. Because it was a unique community that worked together and even had people breaking the law to save the Crosswhite family and paying a fine for that. And then what were they willing to risk? And then, but she really wants to bring it to the action piece, getting the third graders involved. So that's something that I will also put in the folder once it's written. And then in the folder, I also put a fourth grade lesson that's in the form of a PowerPoint. And while I'm here, I will put just put in the chat the link to the Google folder that you can have, that there's all sorts of resources I'll talk about in a minute that I will keep adding to. But this is a lesson that allows fourth graders to look at different documents about the way that Rosa Parks' story is told and really interrogate this myth of her being a tired lady that just decided to sit down, but that she was a part of a community activist. And it goes through a lesson, a character map, and then 4 different sources that they can investigate. So that's just something that you can look at on your own time. So that's a fourth grade one that I wanted to share. Fifth grade, I don't think we probably don't have time to listen to this, but this was put out by what used to be called Teaching Tolerance. It's now called Learning for Justice, just a wonderful source to go to. This is a 5-minute video that students absolutely love, and it uses dance as a language, and it shows how over time dance has been used in the African community to tell the stories of slavery, to actually in your face to the white people as the white land or slave owners. And so it is a marvelous lesson to look at or just play and to add it to the 5th grade curriculum where they're studying this. And this is the link to the YouTube. 5th grade also, as they were establishing a new country, there's a wonderful role play that it may be written a little bit above 5th grade level. It could be adjusted, but it's what if that it wasn't just white men making this decision. It's a role play where the students investigate as if what if women were there? What if indentured servants were there? What if slaves were there? And why weren't they there? And then to think about who benefited the most and the least from the American Revolution, who wrote and ratified the Constitution for the new nation, and then who benefited the most. And then you can bring in those stories of how has over time we the people being redefined? How is the more perfect union being redefined even as it unfolds? How are we a part of that? How are we defining it in the classroom? Who are we the people in the classroom? When we have controversy out on the playground, how are those stories being told? And how do we make a more perfect classroom if we're trying to have a democratic classroom? Another to bring in counter narratives is through holidays. I just did this one in my book club, and what we did was we watched this song America the Beautiful from 2 different perspectives. This one is just 2 girls singing it, 2 white girls. It's got white picket fences. It shows them up on the plain with a beautiful land, and they're the only 2 people in the entire, and it's a very whitewashed version of America the Beautiful. It's beautifully sung, but we looked at it and said, okay, who's telling the story of America the Beautiful? We looked at the lyrics and we interrogated the lyrics. And then we watched America the Beautiful that was actually used during Joe Biden's inauguration. His inauguration ceremonies. And same words, same lyrics, same song, but it just represents almost every group. I think every group of people that you can find. It's got special needs. It's got African Americans. It has the transgender, it has indigenous people, it has Asian, you name it. And it's just and so we say, okay, what story is being told here? How is we the people being defined? And how might that change if we look at that lens? And so holidays are always a great way to bring, you could do this Constitution Day, you could do it in many different days. Another holiday is Indigenous Peoples Day or Columbus Day, and bring in images and say, okay, what story is being told here? And we do the visual thinking strategies here. What story is being told by these people who in 2018 in front of the Smithsonian Museum of American Indians celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day? And how are they defining who we the people is? How are they defining what a more perfect union is? And how are they saying that we need this more shared memory of the history of our country, and that it's okay to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly if we're going to move forward in these stories of healing. And of course, we know that there's always these possibilities that as we do this, I just say that start small. What if you just do one focused inquiry, just one day one? I have found that with my pre-service teachers, they're afraid to do something that might go against the grain, or they're guests in other people's classrooms. And so I have found that public issues are a great way to start with inquiry, because with public issues, for one, you can almost always find resources that give you different perspectives. So for example, I wrote one that I showed to them that I actually did in a 3rd grade classroom. It's quite a age-old question, actually, is what does humans relationship with animals and should animals be kept in zoos. And it was a wonderful way to be involved in local history because Detroit Zoo has just done amazing things to change their zoo over the year. And there's a beautiful 5-minute YouTube that we did chat sessions with. And then we looked at a site where the people against the unethical treatment of animals who just don't believe that there should be zoos. And so I show them that, and then we write public issue lessons for each grade level. So kindergartners are talking about a classroom rule, and first graders are talking about a school rule, and fifth graders are talking about something to do with the Constitution, and third graders are talking about an issue in Michigan. And I find that's a marvelous way to enter inquiry. I've also found that it just works better when you do it with other people. The more heads are better, we can feed off each other, we can divvy up the work. And we know that one of the hardest things is to build up those good resources. So have a way that you're always looking for those, and a way to put them somewhere where you're going to remember where they're. Use ideas always created that are already created. And I think there's many marvelous ones that are being created now that we can pay attention to. But then there's always those problems. You know, how do we make sure that it takes time to do inquiry-based learning. We know that we have these struggles. We know, once again, that it's hard to find resources. We don't have the support to work with other teachers. There's no time, you know, and right now we're all stressed anyway, that it's the last thing on our mind is to redo things. So how do we provide support for each other to start small? Maybe it's one day a week you're going to bring in a current event, or you're going to read a different book. But what are you currently doing that you maybe could do a little bit differently to bring in different stories so that kids start to question the way they see the world, the way they're understanding the world, the way that people understand the world differently. And I think this conference has given us many, many great examples of that. And let's face it, this current climate, I know my pre-service teachers are scared. Everything's political. And so I've been trying to teach them, well, how do we think historically about the past? How do we, so that we can enter it and say, okay, what's the story? Who's telling it? We don't have to, even on current events, I showed them one that's written on the Confederate flag issue, and kids don't have to take a side. They just have to understand what groups who say that the Confederate flag should not be hung in southern states, and what and why. And it's a first grade where you just do bullet points. And then on the other side, you put bullet points for people who think it should, because it's historical. And then you don't let them take sides, you just let them understand the different way that people are interpreting the story. And so I just want to show you some of the resources that I'm going to leave you with. And then I also, from the poem, I just think that as we the people are trying to make a more perfect union, and as we're trying to define who that we the people are, understanding the past so that we can live in the present and envision a better future, we are striving to forge a union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. So how can we instill that love for people and culture and differences in our students? So I did put in the chat, these are the different resources that I put in here. Here's the stories we tell. This is the Google Slides that you can have access to. Here's the I am the dog, I am the cat idea. Here is Takaki. I wrote out the intro that I took the mirror activity from. And then in shared resources, I have some grade level examples, early elementary, I put a few in there from the holiday one, the civic ideals. In the later elementary, I put a few other ones. Here's the role play. And here's the Google Slides for Rosa Parks. And another one that was an investigation that was in the social studies and the young learner. So that is all I have. If anybody has anything that they do to bring in counter narratives and want to share it with us in the chat, or if anybody has any questions for me, we got a few minutes before we sign off. I just appreciate that, you know, those of you who have had long, busy days, here you are at night still learning social studies. That's amazing. Anybody have any questions? Resources for 6th grade. Yeah, I didn't include 6th grade, did I? I taught 6th grade for 20 years. So, but when I did that, we were doing the ancient world. So we envisioned that. So right off the top of my head, I think, you know, the building the communities ones could be, but not specifically off the top of my head, no. But if I would love to work with teachers and be in schools, and if anybody, I love writing incomplete lessons. So feel free to contact me. And when I'm not at my best at this time at night. I've been up since 4 this morning and I'm a morning person. So I probably could think of 100 6th grade ideas tomorrow morning, but right now my brain is kind of like not doing so great. So sorry about that, Annette. Yes, I will share my email. And I kid you not, I love being in classrooms. I love writing lessons with people. ldornbos@oakland.edu. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate you coming, and I hope you have a good rest of the conference. And I will hopefully some way, somehow, see you another place, another time, or be invited into your classroom to do some work together. All right. Thank you. Bye.